Very sensitive. So I'm guessing you in the back can hear what I am saying. I am Laurie Kearney. I'm a local historian, a genealogist, and an educator. I'm really excited to talk to you today about slavery here in Norfolk County. It's an ongoing study that I have, and this is the first portion of it. I need to do the rest. So I'm really focusing on towns that were part of the original Dedham land grant. So I first became interested in this topic when my church asked me to do some research on a local enslaved man, and it was a really interesting study. But as I've discovered, once you get, you've answered one question, about 20 more pop up. And so that's how this kind of grew. I'm going to keep my script because my children will tell you, and those of you who know me here, once I start talking, I may not stop. So this, I just want to point this headstone out here. If some of you know that I gave walking tours of the cemeteries here in town last summer, and I've done a census of the cemeteries, most of the cemeteries in the area. This is a headstone of a formerly enslaved man. It's the only one I know of in our general area, I can tell you. Not in Norwood, not in Dedham, not in Walpole, not in Sharon, not in Norfolk, all towns that I've done censuses of. This man, it says, in memory of Peter Warren, who died January 9th, 1814, aged about 70 years. And then the epitaph here, which is really small, it says, a respectable man of color. All right, so before I want to talk to you about our local history, I want to talk to you about the history of slavery in general, and especially here in Massachusetts, because obviously it affects the history of slavery here in Walpole and in Dedham, on the land grant towns. So in the 1600s, soon after Europeans established colonies up and down the Atlantic coast, they all practice slavery. And you can see North Carolina goes all the way to the Mississippi. So as does Georgia and North Carolina and Virginia. So it covered a large area. So today, many people are often surprised to learn that at one time, Massachusetts residents could legally own slaves. In fact, captured Africans began arriving in New England as soon as the English began settling Massachusetts. The earliest recording is a ship that arrived in Boston Harbor in 1638. Listing on the ship was some sugar, some tobacco, and some Negroes. And the ship was actually returning from the South. It had actually taken indigenous people to be enslaved in the South. So this practice remained acceptable in the Commonwealth until 1783, when a judicial declaration was made that the Massachusetts state constitution did not support slavery. Compared to other states, people of color, both enslaved and freed, were a small percent of Massachusetts' population. Most lived in large port towns like Boston or Salem, and the percentage was about 10% of the population was people of color. People who lived out here in the countryside, there were enslaved people, but the population was closer to 1.2% of the population. So why were enslaved people needed in the remote countryside of Massachusetts, where most farms were basically subsistence farms? In other words, a farm that was big enough to support your family, right? Grow your food, your hay, pasture your animals. Your family could live off of the land. So in 1620, is the arrival of the Pilgrims, and 10 years later, the Puritans settled Massachusetts Bay Colony. And then 6 years after that, Dedham was settled. During 1636 and 1638 was the Pequot War. It was a war here that the English colonists fought with the Pequots, a native tribe. They captured, they took the people that they captured, they enslaved. So one of the things they discovered is if they enslaved a local indigenous person, he knew how to get home. And he often walked away. So they began shipping them out and shipping them to the Caribbean and shipping them to the Carolinas where it wasn't easy for them to get home. In fact, the ship that arrived in Boston in 1638 was returning from taking those captives away from New England. I'm on my timeline. So in 1638, the first Africans arrived in Boston. 1641, the Bodies of Liberty was a law that was written, and in it, it makes slavery legal. So Massachusetts was the first colony to legalize slavery. 3 years later, the Bodies of Liberties became an article within the New England Confederation, thus making slavery legal throughout New England. So the triangle trade begins in the mid-1600s. Here in New England, one of our industries was we made rum. And in order to make rum, we needed molasses, which comes from sugar. So the sugar came from the South, the Caribbean islands, and some of the southern colonies. The sugar came up to Massachusetts, where it was offloaded, and then the rum was put on the ships, and it was sent to Europe and Africa to be sold. Once in Africa, slaves and Africans were picked up and enslaved, and they were shipped to the southern states or to the Caribbean to work the sugar fields. They were offloaded, sugar was loaded, and the triangle trade, that's the triangle trade. The sugar came back to New England to make rum. In 1670, the Bodies of Liberties was amended to include children born into slavery. So if the mother was enslaved, her child, when it was born, would be enslaved and would also be the property of the owner of the mother. In 1700 and 1725, I have a nice list. I'm going to have to look at that. There was a lot of laws were passed in Massachusetts which restricted what people of color, basically, whether you were free or enslaved, could and could not do. So in 1703, there was a curfew. They couldn't be out after dark. 1705, interracial marriages were deemed illegal. 1728, a law was established that prohibited them from carrying sticks because they were seen as a weapon. And in 1703, a law was passed where if a slave owner wanted to free someone that they were holding in bondage, they had to pay a bond to the town of 50 pounds, which is a lot of money in 1703. And that was because what was happening was the enslavers were freeing their enslaved people who were too old or too weak to work. So they were of no use to keep, and they were just simply going to be an expense. So they freed them. But because they couldn't work for their enslaver, they also couldn't work to support themselves. And so they ended up on what they called the town's poor rolls. So the town ended up paying to support this person. And so the idea was either A, if money was given to the town and that person became chargeable, they needed to be supported by the town, there was money there to support them. Or the enslaver might say, I'm not paying that. and I can take care of them myself. So then the person would remain enslaved, but likely not worked, but at least they would be taken care of. And then in 1760 and through 1775, there was an awful lot of freedom cases. So one thing that's actually really unique about Massachusetts, where enslaved people actually had a lot of rules that controlled them, and they were almost sort of like non-citizens, but they could easily access the courts. And they often brought suits against their owners for their freedom. Oh, he promised me he'd freed me when I was so old, or and those cases had mixed results. Sometimes someone got their freedom, and sometimes they didn't. But what's interesting, I've read a lot of books that have been written about slavery in Massachusetts, some as early as the late 1700s. So under 10, 15 years when slavery ended in the state, they were starting to write about it. In a particular book I read that was written in 1866, that author noted there were about 17 court cases. It was kind of an anomaly is what he was saying. But in the last 10 years, historians have been going into archives looking for court cases, and they are finding more and more of these court cases. So the number is climbing, which is pretty neat that as a historian we're finding more about this. All right, so Massachusetts state constitution changed everything. In 1780, after the end of the Revolutionary War, by the way, if anybody wants to ask questions, please feel free. After the Revolutionary War, several court cases, freedom cases, were brought against the owners. And their argument this time wasn't that you promised you'd free me. It was the Massachusetts State Constitution says all men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights, among them which may be reckoned the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, that of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, in fine, that of seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness. And this woman here her name is Mumbet. She was the first person to bring a court case against her owner, and she won. So in 1783, on July 8th in 1783, the Massachusetts Supreme Court Chief Justice William Cushing, and because he's a rich guy, we have a picture of him. He was a slave owner himself. He was on the Massachusetts Supreme Court, and he was overhearing some of these court cases. In fact, it was basically the last freedom case. It's referred to as the Commonwealth versus Jennison. Jennison was an enslaver who was being accused of beating a man who was now free. And so that man was suing him for abusing him. And it worked its way up to the Supreme Court. And when the judge was giving the directions to the jury before they went off and deliberated, he said to them, "Slavery, in my judgment, is effectively abolished as it can be by granting the rights and privileges in the Constitution wholly incompatible and repugnant to its existence, insinuating that enslaved people living in Massachusetts were considered free per the Constitution, and highlighting that the jury was not deciding whether Quack Walker was free, but whether he had been abused by his past owner." The jury found with the state that Jennison was indeed guilty. However, so it appears that he was telling the court, the jury, that this wasn't about about whether people were enslaved, and the jury, as I said, found that Quock Walker was indeed abused. This statement that I've gotten lost in my notes, kids. So this statement is considered by a lot of people to be the end of slavery in 1783 in our state. But I would say scholarly historians note that because no law was actually written, although I would argue they didn't need to write a law because the Constitution is the law, people were not freed immediately. So it wasn't like a hammer was hit down. His statement wasn't about a law. It was just telling the jury that slavery, according to the Constitution, isn't a thing in this state. And so people were freed slowly. So this is the 1790 census. A lot of people will point to this census as the end numbers for New England. And you can see next to Maine and New Hampshire, Maine was part of Massachusetts until 1820. No slaves were counted in the state. Now, that book that I read that was written in 1866, the author said he'd spoke to the granddaughter of a man who was a census taker in 1790, and that he was told to not count people if they were enslaved, to count them as all other free persons. The first column is white men over 16. The second column is white males under 16. The next column is white females, then slaves and all other persons. A lot of people will point to this census and say, look, slavery was over. So now we're up to Dedham. Dedham was settled in 1636. It was to help alleviate overcrowding in Watertown. The Great and General Court of Massachusetts established the town of Dedham. Dedham's original land grant contained thousands of acres of land. It stretched as far south as Rhode Island. So you can see that here's Rentham, and here's Rhode Island, and this is Plainville, which eventually part of it became Attleboro, and it has Natick, this is Dedham, and Westwood, Norwood, Walpole. So these were all of the towns that made up today. These are all the towns today that make up the original Dedham land grant. And with the set-off date, and there's Walpole, 1724. We just celebrated our 300th anniversary. But some of the other towns were larger, like Medfield included the land of Medway and Millis, and Rentham contained what's today Franklin, Norfolk, and Plainville. The Dedham land grant was a large space. And the towns from the Dedham land grant were originally selected by me for this study because for several reasons. One, we share similar history. We are all agricultural communities from the 1700s. There was some industry in these towns along the waterways. There were mills. So then looking, so these are more censuses that are taken. So I was looking for people of color living in Massachusetts per the censuses. And over many years, a variety of censuses were taken, usually to kind of figure out what was taxable. So I know that there's more before 1754, and gosh, I'd like to find them. But 1754 is a slave census. You can see by the numbers, the people in that census were over 16, so they did not count teenagers or children, and likely seniors, because seniors wouldn't have been useful. They were the Massachusetts residents were suspicious that this wasn't about counting heads as much as it was, what can we tax? What assets do these people own? And so they might have fudged a little bit on their answers. And then 1765 is a state census. It was conducted by His Majesty's Board of Trade. It seemed that England wanted accurate numbers regarding the amount of people that lived in the colony, as well as some of the assets they had, and likely for taxation purposes. But lucky for the historian who studies slavery, His Majesty wanted to know how many whites, blacks, indigenous, and French Acadians there were living in the state. Because, you have to keep an eye on those French. So there was a war going on in Canada, and Massachusetts took in about 2,000 refugees. Walpole had a couple of families living here, a couple of families living in Medfield, and eventually the states would ask to be reimbursed for their care. So His Majesty wanted to make sure how many were here so that the town didn't say, yeah, there were 20 that lived in our town. But it counted Negroes, both male and female. In 1771, there's a tax inventory. I haven't found all of them, which is why there are some blank spaces there. But it included data regarding the type and the value of real estate, as well as a tabulation of livestock and farm commodities they produced. And it also had a column for servants for life. And then there's the 1790 census. So I just showed you there were no slaves in Massachusetts in 1790. That was all rolled into people of color, all other people living in the state. And I feel that when I look at these numbers, so we've got 17 slaves in Dedham in 1754, not including teens or youth. Let me see, I'll stand over here. And then in 1765, we have 21 and 15, which is what, about 35? 45. 10 here, 16 here. So the numbers have stayed pretty stable across all of the villages that I looked at, with a little bit of fluctuation here and there. So then I also looked looked at the same censuses in some of the larger towns in the area. And so Boston, we clearly is the largest city and has also had a large population of enslaved people. 998 were counted in the 1754 census, and 761 all other people in the 1790 census, which I think between this slave census, which again doesn't count teens or children and likely elderly, so between here, it's going to be well over 1,000 people, and the federal census. Oh, and this doesn't count free people. The seventh, right? So we've got a number that's almost 1,000 that doesn't include teens and children, or elderly, or free people, or native people, which also would be rolled into the federal census, all others. So that shows a pretty dramatic drop. Salem, it appears as though there is an increase. Scituate, I think, kind of stays stable. And Dartmouth, which included Fairhaven, Acushnet, I think Westport as well. It was a large town, went all the way down to the waterfront where, and we know New Bedford was pretty big in shipbuilding. So its numbers, I think, increase here, right? So if Dartmouth included Dartmouth, Fairhaven, Acushnet, and I believe New Bedford as well, all of these towns, yeah, there's New Bedford. I didn't put that in my thing here. If you add 83, 38, 55, you come up with 176. And before, all of those spaces had only 34. So that's a large increase of of all others. So it kind of shows how people moved around. But I think in Boston, it shows that a lot of people were shipped off and sold. So the forgotten slavery here in Norfolk County. So one of the things I did when I first started looking things up is I did some pretty simple Google searches. Slavery in Walpole, slavery in Medfield, slavery in Dedham. And other than Walpole quoting a book that had been written in 1888 that we had an enslaved man named Jack here, Medfield has a lot online about the Underground Railroad. This house still stands. It's Joseph Allen's house. It's on North Street in Medfield. Joseph Allen was a stop on the Underground Railroad, but he was also a conductor. And there's another house that Medfield knows of that was a stop on the Underground Railroad. Dedham talks about this man here. His name is William B. Gould. He was born into slavery in 1838 and in the South and escaped. He served during the Civil War and eventually came to settle here in Dedham. And became a valued citizen in Dedham's, the town of Dedham. In 2023, they built this statue here to honor him. But no one talked about Massachusetts was a slave-holding town, which blew my mind. So now, my job was to find people who were enslaved. And I know it won't surprise you, but the very, very poor don't leave a lot behind in records, right? They weren't buying land deeds, articles weren't being written about them in newspapers. They're kind of invisible in our society. So I approached this study trying to find these people so I could talk about them and tell their stories, was I had to figure out who in these communities were rich enough to own slaves. Because if most of the farms here were subsistence farms, those families couldn't afford a slave. So historians find that ministers are some of the wealthiest people in town. So I looked at ministers, and then there were tavern keepers, small business people, and I also considered wealthy landowners. So if they had a lot of land, if their farm was not a subsistence farm, 40 acres. If it was 200 acres, that was a rich guy. Maybe he had slaves. So my next step was to then go and look for their histories. When were they born? When did they die? Where did they come from? Did they leave a will? And then I went looking for their will, and if they might have noted that they were leaving their Negro servant to so-and-so. And then I found the servant. So this is a partial list of people that I found just in Dedham. It's up to about 45 enslaved and formerly enslaved people in Dedham, so it's only a partial list. I had put up a full list, but it didn't fit on the slide and you couldn't see it. Other than you could go, wow, that looks like a lot of names up there. Some of them, so like this Jack, you'll see names that pop up frequently. So here's a Jenny, and there's Primus and Jenny. There's a Jack here and a Jack here. I think there's a Caesar here. There's a Caesar here. So some of these names may be the same Jack or the same Caesar. So the number really isn't 45. It's probably a little bit less that I found at this point. But now I have names, and I have names of enslavers as well. For instance, H. Fisher's is Hannah Fisher. And in her probate records, it was just listed that she had a Negro woman, no name, but she was a thing, right? She wasn't a person, which I think also kind of reflects how enslaved people were seen in our community. So, what were the lives like of enslaved people who lived in the countryside of Massachusetts? For enslaved people, it was greatly accepted, historians greatly accept that they lived in the home with their masters. The Isaac Royal House in Medford has slave quarters. That's very, very unusual. And as I said, most of the enslavers, the population out here in the Dedham towns was about 1.2% of the population. So if someone owned a slave, they maybe owned one, maybe two. Every now and then you see three. So you didn't really need slave quarters. So enslaved people lived with their enslavers in their home. They ate dinner with them at the dinner table. They probably had a room in the attic where they slept. In terms of what they did for their families, if they lived on a farm, they would have helped with the farm. I believe that one of the reasons ministers needed an enslaved person was because they had to take care of the members of their church. They had to represent their church in other towns. They took in students on the side. They were very often the only well-educated person in town. I happen to know that Thomas Bulch, the minister in Norwood, tutored many, many young boys who went on to become ministers. And he would have certainly collected a wage. But he also had his own subsistence farm. And if he was teaching and writing sermons and going to neighboring towns to represent his hometown, his home church, he probably didn't have time to take care of the farm animals and chop wood and tend to the fields. And so having an enslaved person on hand would have been very helpful. One thing that those censuses show us also, they broke out men and women. Most of the enslaved people in Massachusetts were men. They were needed for their labor. There were not a lot of enslaved women. And so you find that very often enslaved men have a relationship, marriage with a Native American woman who lives locally. Enslaved people were also, I found, some were repeatedly sold again and again and again. I find this to possibly be because they perhaps had a skill that was needed by a particular person. Maybe they were carpenter. They needed to build a barn or a house or something. So they bought a slave. When the house or the barn was done, he sold that slave to someone else. Then there are people that spent the majority of their adult life with their enslavers. There were laws. We talked about that. An enslaved person couldn't just go to church and get married. They needed permission from their enslaver. And if their enslaver didn't give it to them, they couldn't get married. And then, as we know, if a child was born into the union, the child was the property of the mother's enslaver. A married couple also didn't live together, because if one fellow was enslaved with someone over here and the wife was enslaved with someone over here, they stayed with their enslavers. So the family unit wasn't a traditional family unit as we think of today. And the thing with children was they're often viewed as another mouth to feed. And an enslaver might think, Jenny's had another baby. I can't afford to keep that baby. And you find a lot of advertisements in local New England papers where people are giving away a baby. So that would be what the family life would look like. And some enslaved people actually were skilled laborers, maybe a blacksmith, a basket maker, a baker. You tended to find those skills more in the cities where there was a constant need for that skill than you find out here in the countryside. So most of the people that lived out here were physical laborers. They worked on the farm, they worked in the taverns. Okay. So the other piece of this pie is understanding Massachusetts poor laws, because they greatly affected the lives of formerly enslaved people who were often incredibly poor. I would have loved to have had something else to put up, but in going through Walpole records, this has nothing to do with slavery, but I think it also shows about how, okay, let me go back. So, it was decided, the general court decided that who would be responsible for the local poor people. And they decided it was the town where that person belonged. In the case of people who had been freed, it would be the town that received the bond payment from the enslaver when they freed someone. So I just want to clarify that belonged doesn't mean that they were owned by the town, but that is where they lived. In this case, belonged means that that's their hometown. So the difference between this book belongs to me and this book belongs on the shelf. So when people were, let me show you. So formerly enslaved people stayed in the community where they toiled because they belonged to that town. And that was, so should they become poor and they could not support themselves, they became chargeable. The town had to pay for them. The town would step in and provide food and shelter. A town where one was a stranger, not from the community, they would be warned out of town, which would mean they were ordered to leave, especially if the town viewed that they were, they might become chargeable. This piece here says, this may inform the Honorable Selectmen here in Walpole. In this difficult time, I cannot provide for myself and 2 children, and I should be glad that your honors would take care and place out my 2 children in good places, Isaac and Moses. It's dated 1779, and it's signed by Deborah Chamberlain. Deborah's husband, Moses, died fighting in the Revolutionary War. She was a young mom. Isaac was about 1, and her son Moses Jr. was about 3. And she had no way of supporting her family. And as a young couple just starting out, they probably didn't have a lot of assets. So she was going home to West Roxbury because that's where she belonged. Her children, Isaac and Moses, were born here in Walpole. They belonged here. So Moses' family is buried, young Moses. He stayed in the area, his family, I believe it's been a while, at the rural cemetery on Pemberton. And Isaac is actually, his son, Isaac Jr., is buried at the Norwood Cemetery. So they still stayed local. So this is how families were separated. So let's see. So I would like to start to talk to you a little bit about some of the people that I've met along the way. Once freed, formerly enslaved person who had a skilled trade was able to find employment and thus support himself and a family member and his family. However, those who were only able to provide physical labor, like help chop the wood, bring in the harvest, frequently had a difficult time finding steady employment, and often ended up on the town's poor rolls. So the first group of people I would like to tell you about that I've met along the way is some people that had specialized training. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about Caesar. He wasn't hidden in the records. This was an easy find. But in the town of Rentham, Francis Nicholson was a plane maker who owned a black man named Caesar Cheller. Caesar's exact birth date is unknown. However, it is thought he was born about 1720. He was owned by Nicholson as early as 1736. In 1741, Caesar was admitted to the Congregational Church in Rentham Center, so he would have been about 21 years old. He was an adult. He could choose to be a member of the church. Caesar became free when Nicholson died in 1753. When Nicholson died, he not only gave Caesar his freedom, but all his plane-making tools and his workbench, as well as 10 acres of land. During the years that Caesar was owned by Nicholson, he obviously learned Nicholson's trade, making planes. From his training and with Nicholson's tools, Caesar was able to support himself and his family. Today, Caesar is believed to be one of the first African Americans to have an independent business here in the colonies. Caesar married Judah Russell in 1758, and together they became the parents of 8 children. In 1784, Caesar died without a will, but his estate was administered to, so someone was appointed to assess the estate. And at that time, it was valued at 77 pounds and 2 shillings. Today, Caesar is believed to be one of the best colonial plane makers, and his planes can fetch thousands of dollars. And this is one of his planes. He marked it with his initials, so colonial plane collectors are able to identify his planes. So Caesar's story is unusual because most enslaved people's stories are lost to history, especially those that lived in small agricultural villages. Caesar pops up, his planes pop up on the PBS Antique Roadshow from time to time. In fact, I think I snapped that picture. I just froze the YouTube station, took a picture of it. So the next person I would like to tell you about is Newport Green. He was a nailer. So the Medfield Historical Archives have a sales receipt for Newport Green, an enslaved man who was sold to Moses Hartson, this is Moses's house, by Uriah Morse. This is the first documentation in 1763 that Newport appears in. According to Newport's military papers, he was a Revolutionary War soldier. He was born in 1741, and like most enslaved people, his origins are unknown. Newport was a nailer, a skilled laborer who made nails. Where and when he learned this trade is unknown. The sale price for Newport was 60 pounds, which is a pretty high price for him, but certainly indicates that he was a skilled laborer. Which made him more valuable. Knowing who his 2 enslavers were, Uriah Morse, an innkeeper, and Moses Hartson, a blacksmith, may provide the answer to where Newport learned to be a nailer, but it also indicates that it doesn't tell us where he learned that skill, but it certainly indicates that by 1763, he had a skill as likely a blacksmith. It's not known how long Newport was enslaved by Hartson, but Medfield history tells us that the residents of Medfield were mortified by how Hartson treated Newport. And they took up a collection, and they paid for his freedom, and they paid for the bond, and Newport became free. Don't know when he took the surname Green. It's hinted his friend was a man named Warwick Green, and that it's hinted that he may have taken his friend's surname because they were friends. But what we do know is by the time he enlisted is in the militia, I think it's 1771, 1778, to serve a 2-month term. We know he was free by then. He went on to serve 2 more terms in Medfield's militia in 1779 and again in 1780. In April of 1782, Newport bought an acre of land with a dwelling house. And the records will say dwelling house thereon, meaning it's on the property, but it doesn't list any other shops on the property. So there wasn't a smithy or a nailer shop or anything. It was just a house. And he bought it with his friend Warwick Green. And he owned it for about 5 years. And then he sold his share of the Medfield property. And at that time, the deed says it contained a nailer shop. And the property, if you are driving down 109 and you drive past the Vine Lake Cemetery, and really before the marsh across the street starts to open up, his house was there. In fact, there's several small houses that were all owned by, and that's where Peter Warren lived. There was a woman named Sarah Brandt who lived there. Her house is immortalized in a painting that hangs in the MFA. But it seems like a lot of people of color lived in that little strip of land. Let's see. Well, wait a minute. Let me finish this. So in the early in 84, Newport got married, and he initially settled in Medfield, and then moved to Natick. By 1793, his wife was an indigenous woman who was part of the Natick Praying Indians. And they lived in Natick, very close to the West Needham border, now Wellesley. Initially, in the 1798 tax list, he was renting a 3-acre property from Peter Brandt. And it appears that Newport found jobs as a nailer, and he was able to afford a comfortable life for his family. In fact, he was hired to make nails for the West Needham schoolhouse, and the Needham Historical Society has a receipt for his work. He did so well, earning a living, that he was able to help other poor people, probably poor people of color in his community, often taking them in to his own home or helping them perhaps get some food or something. But then something happened in the early 1800s, and life for Newport and his family totally changed. And that was, there was a machine that was made that could make nails. And so he wasn't able to find work anymore because his skill was not needed. He could probably crank out 1 nail a minute, and the machine could crank out how many nails a day. So anyhow, he ended up having to move back to Medfield, probably because they had a bond there. But he never appears on Medfield's poor rolls. He died in 1816. So Newport was experienced great financial success when he was able to make a living as a skilled laborer, making nails, but he was able to help others less fortunate. But when his need for his skill went away, it appears he struggled financially. Newport's fall from the haves to the have-nots illustrates how a skilled person of color had an easier time supporting himself and his family versus one that was simply an unskilled laborer. So this is Sambo Freeman. He was a carpenter. He lived in Medway. He originally was owned by William and Bethia Burgess. And when William died, and I think this is William's estate. Let's see, that means he's going to be here. Bed, chest, tea kettle, 6 pewter somethings, an old chest of drawers, a maple table. I'm sure I snipped this because he was here. Estate of containing 18 acres. Yeah, it should be here. I need to do a better job snipping. So he's listed in William. Oh no, that's Sambo's estate, not William's estate. So this is what Sambo acquired. He was a carpenter. He was a master carpenter. He bought his own freedom. So when William Burgess's estate was settled, his widow, Burgess's widow, sold Sambo to John Adams of Wrentham, and then Sambo was able to pay John Adams of Wrentham for his freedom. He settled in Holliston, and when he died, he had quite a sizable estate. He had here, it says, real estate of said deceased situated in Holliston containing about 18 acres with the buildings thereon. His wife, Eleanor, was a weaver, and also in this inventory says there was a weaving loom with several yards of fabric, and the weaving loom had was ready for weaving. When Sambo was freed, he took the name Freeman, probably to indicate his legal status. He fought in Medway's militia. He served during the French and Indian War. And then he moved to Medway in 1766. He died in 1797 of a fever at, as the minister wrote, nearly 80 years old, which gives us an idea when he was born. His wife died a year later, and his youngest child died the following year as well. Caesar and Newport and Sambo were all skilled laborers. They appear on the town's poor rolls, and when they died, they left behind a sizable estate of land and personal items. And these factors indicate that they were skilled workers were able to support themselves. The next group I'd like to talk to you about are formerly enslaved people who did not have specialized training. So this is Jack Robbins. He lived here in Walpole. He came to Walpole sometime between 1755 and 1760. We really don't know how old he was, or where he came from, or where his parents, or who were his parents, which is not unusual. That seems to be the case for most of these people. But we do know that he was owned by Deacon Robbins, who's had a tavern not too far from where the Walpole Historical Society is today, a little bit further down the street there. And Deacon Robbins was a wealthy landowner. He had something like 200 acres of land and a tavern. He and his wife were in their 60s when Jack came to live with them. They did not have children, so they clearly would have needed an extra pair of hands to help on the farm and in the tavern. When Deacon Robbins died, in his will, he gave everything, his land, all of his belongings, to his wife. But when his wife died, he wanted his property to go to the Walpole Church. And he laid out 3 conditions, and one was to take care of Jack should he become chargeable. So Jack is found in 1787 living in Attleboro. It's where he was found paying taxes, and it's also where he married a woman of color, a free woman of color. Her family had not been enslaved for 2 generations. And by 1789, Jack was probably feeling the aches and pains of having worked a long life as a laborer. And reached out to the church here in Walpole and let them know that he was going to be coming home. And they began making arrangements for how to care for him. Jack and the church had some issues. I think Jack felt like the church should not only care for him, but also for Hannah. His wife, he felt that the statement the church was to take tender care of Jack included his wife and children should he have them. The church did not feel that way. They first went looking to see if their marriage was legal, because if they weren't legally married, they could ship Hannah back to Norton because that's where she belonged. But because Jack belonged here and Jack was the man, Hannah belonged with him. Thereby, Hannah now belonged to Walpole. There was a lot of back and forth between the church and Jack, never really coming to a settlement, but the town paid for Hannah. They supported Hannah, but very often Hannah was living in one place and Jack was in another, and I think they wanted to be together. So this is interesting. In 1795, Jack and Hannah left town and went to Boston. It was a large community on Beacon Hill of formerly enslaved people up there. I think they felt they could move there and live there together. And send the bills back to Walpole. And Walpole took out this legal statement saying, yeah, we're taking care of this guy. We're meeting the rules and regulations. Do not take any debt on from him because we're not going to pay it. So Jack eventually came back to Walpole. He died here in 1810. So it's another Jack, and I think he's one of the several Jacks I pointed out on my list of people I found in Dedham. So he and his family were from Dedham, and historian Christine Gray Mullen has done extensive search on Jack Garish and his family. And due to her research, we are able to tell the story of Jack when he was still enslaved. So we know he was born in 1744. We don't know who his parents are. Is the case. In records, he's consistently called mulatto. So he was of indigenous and African ancestry. And he was sold to several local families. In 1757, Nathaniel Ames purchased him. Ames owned a large estate, which included a tavern, and he was also a known printer. So he obviously needed extra people on hand. I think he had several people in his estate, if I recall. So after Ames died, the estate sold him to the Hoare family of Westminster, Massachusetts, and Jack ran away. This is a really bad faded image of the ad when Jack ran away. But what's interesting is it describes what he looks like. It says he's 6 feet high and very black, and he also took a violin with him. So he had the ability to play music. And having a violin in a tavern would mean that a tavern could offer some entertainment. Anyhow, Jack... in 1770, so that was in 1770, and then he is known to have been living with Eliphalet Pond, and that house would be just about where I think the Roach Brothers in Westwood is, a little further down the road, because Westwood was Dedham at that time. And so I think Jack got his freedom when it was decided that Massachusetts' constitution didn't support it in 1783. In 1785, he married a woman named Anna. We don't know what her surname is. We don't know where she came from. We don't know anything about her. Their children, these are the names of their children. They are registered in Dedham documents. Their births are registered in Dedham documents, as is Jack's death. It appears that they spent the majority of their lives in Dedham because they were never warned out of town, which would indicate they didn't belong there. And when Jack died, the town noted that he had been living in the workhouse. So it's highly unlikely that he found unskilled labor jobs. For instance, the historian found that he had worked on the Boston-Providence Highway in 1803. We know that highway is Washington Street. So that shows that he was finding physical labor. As he got older, it's probably hard to find jobs, hence he ended up in the poorhouse. So Jack Robbins and Jack Garish experienced two very different kinds of freedom after 1783 than Caesar, Sambo, and Newport. In the end, they and their family members were all supported by the town to which they belonged, or by a designated guardian, as in Jack. These men had the freedom to support themselves while they were young enough to find work, but as they aged and likely could not find work, they became chargeable and indeed needed their hometowns to support them. So the final group I would like to tell you about is Flora and London. They were laborers. They actually never left the care of their enslaver even after 1783. Historians might argue that their enslavers kept them enslaved and they just didn't know they had freedom. It's also possible that they decided to stay with their enslaver for free room and board to do work around the house because the only other option would have been to go to the poorhouse. And staying with the family and doing what you've been doing all along might have looked better. I don't know. They were both at one time owned by the minister, Nathan Bucknam. Flora was always owned by Nathan Bucknam. Bucknam sold London to Jonathan Adams, Jasper Adams. No, Jonathan, his nephew. And then Bucknam left a codicil in his will saying that if his will was that Flora would stay and care for her mistress, meaning Mrs. Bucknam, and that when she died, Flora could choose to go and live with one of the Bucknam children, that money would follow her so the child could financially care for Flora, and that Flora was not expected to work for her keep. But Flora did not live long enough to see this retirement. She died in 1792 here. And Nathan died in 95 and his wife died in 96. But the other thing, so this page is from here, the Medway Vital Records book under the deaths of Negroes, etc. So Flora, London, and Pomp all at one time were owned by Reverend Bucknam. And you can see that these people died in 1792, Flora and London, but the town noted that they were the Negro manservant too, the Negro woman servant too. So someone might say, yep, they were still owned by their enslavers. So in conclusion, these case studies illustrate what the lives of formerly enslaved and enslaved people were like that lived in agricultural communities outside of Boston. The Smithsonian online exhibit defines freedom for an enslaved person as, quote, the hope of self-determination, educational opportunities, and the full rights of citizenship. This definition is a good metric in which to look at the lives of formerly enslaved people to determine their freedom status. But the reality was that people of color lived in the margins of society. They were expected to follow Massachusetts' early slave codes, such as adhering to curfews. They were expected to pay taxes but could not vote. In Medway, London and Flora were relegated to sit in designated pews of the church for people of color, because there was a pretty good sized population there. We didn't have that here in Walpole. The state poor laws made it impossible for people of color to relocate to new towns, perhaps to find work, perhaps to live with a child who could support them. Most likely, they had a hard time finding employment, especially when all they could offer was unskilled labor. They could not support themselves, then likely they would become chargeable, and ultimately ending up on the town's poor rolls, where they would not have had many options or choices. The question is, did Jack Garish, Flora, Jack Robbins, and London have these freedoms? And what about Caesar, Chancellor, Newport Green, and Sambo Freeman, who all seem to have experienced a more prosperous kind of freedom, as they were able to buy property and they had a skill? Jack Garish appears to have struggled to support himself and his family. Jack Robbins ended up a ward of the church, and both Flora and London never left the care of their enslavers. All subjects and their families noted in the study experienced some level of unfreedom. So thank you. I'll take questions. And I think I kept it to an hour. Yes?
What about indentured servitude? Was there any interaction or relationship between slavery and...
So she's asking about indentured servitude. So indentured servitude was a form of education. So you might indenture your son to the local blacksmith. You might indenture your daughter to a person who knows how to weave. And the paper, an agreement was written up that the person who took on the indentured servant would, these young people, they were often about 13 years old, would go live with them. They would be supported by them. They would learn this trade. And at the end of 7 years, the indentured servant agreement had ended, and those children could be free. I showed you the, go back. So here, this is called an elopement advertisement. It says, "We, the subscribers, being chosen a committee on the behalf of the Church of Christ in Walpole to take care of and suitably provide for a Negro man by the name of Jack, formerly the servant of Deacon Ezekiel Robbins of said Walpole, deceased, agreeable to the will of said Robbins, do hereby inform the public, to all whom it may concern, that we have made suitable provision for and do, and at all times stand ready to take due care of said Negro." So basically, we're not going to pay his bills. I see a lot of these when a wife leaves her husband. I'll see a lot of this. My wife has left my home and my bed, and I provide for her. And if you take her in, I'm not going to pay her bills. But I have seen those same advertisements for kids who run away from their indenture. And that person will often advertise, they'll say, "This young man, so many high, wearing this outfit, has left my home. And he's legally responsible for him. He's making a statement. I'm not paying his bills." So, is a wife enslaved to her husband? Is an indentured teen enslaved to his indenturer? Today, we'd probably say that's really kind of a broad statement. We certainly know that people were owned by enslavers, and so it's very different. But an indenture would end, and the child would leave with a trade. Other questions? Oh, come on. At New Pond Village, they wouldn't stop asking questions.
The headstone that you showed in the beginning, where is that?
That's in the Medfield Cemetery, Vine Lake Cemetery. I actually haven't been there. Maybe, Claire, you could take me there sometime. No. Any other questions? No? Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming out. I hope you've all learned something today. How many people were surprised to find that slavery was legal in Massachusetts? How many was that news to you? Well, that shows you how, as historians, we haven't talked about it. So now you know. Yes. Hi. Yes, Sue. So there are houses here in Walpole that are believed to be part of the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad, people came up on the ships and in hiding and got off in New Bedford, and then went by foot through a variety of towns, and there were conductors. They came through our towns and then went through basically Concord and then up into New Hampshire. That was kind of the path they took. There is a book at the Walpole Historical Society about the anti-slavery movement that was here in Walpole. It's a booklet, but it talks about the different people that were part of it. In fact, if you were on my tour at the rural cemetery, there's a lot of formerly people who were really involved in the Underground Railroad here in Walpole. They're buried there. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you. Look, everybody's sitting here in the front because they just don't want to get up and walk away. Thank you.